Snow weeps across the docks of Quonset Point, Rhode Island. The Atlantic wind cuts through the night as cranes groan above frozen piers. Sparks fly orange against gray, as welders bend sheets of corrugated steel into perfect semicircles. The air smells of salt, oil, and ambition. Men in heavy coats work side by side with women in coveralls, their breath visible in the cold. The rhythmic hammering echoes like artillery in the distance. Every strike shapes something new, something urgent. Under the glow of floodlights, a naval officer watches as the first curved shell rises from the mud. A strange half-barrel building unlike anything before. No bricks, no beams, just arching metal and ingenuity. A shelter that can be shipped anywhere, assembled by untrained hands and survived the extremes of war. Behind him, a row of finished huts gleams faintly in the snow. Tomorrow, hundreds more will roll out by train. Within months, tens of thousands. The officer murmurs quietly, "They'll house an army." He's right. In a matter of months, America will erect over 100,000 of these steel shells across the globe. Proof that industrial speed can win wars. The question is, how did they do it? The United States in early 1942 was a nation stunned, but awakening. The attack on Pearl Harbor had turned isolation into mobilization overnight. In just weeks, Washington realized that winning this new global war would require something more than courage or firepower. It would require infrastructure. Millions of men would soon be drafted, trained, and sent overseas. They would need barracks before they ever fired a rifle, workshops before a tank could roll, and hospitals before the first wounded returned. America faced a logistical nightmare: how to shelter and support a rapidly expanding military force that would span continents. Traditional construction methods, brick, timber, concrete, were too slow, too heavy, too dependent on skilled labor. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers needed something different, a structure that could be mass-produced, flat-packed, shipped anywhere, and assembled quickly, even by untrained troops. In early 1941, before the U.S. had even entered the war, a small group of engineers and naval planners gathered at Quonset Point Naval Air Station in Rhode Island. Their mission: design the most practical portable military building in history. They studied Britain's Quonset Hut, a semi-cylindrical shelter made from corrugated steel and used widely during World War I. It was a clever design, but imperfect. The British version leaked under tropical rain, overheated in desert sun, and froze in northern winters. The Americans believed they could do better, stronger, lighter, faster. They called in the George A. Fuller Construction Company, a firm known for building skyscrapers like the Flatiron Building in New York. Together with the Navy's Bureau of Yards and Docks, they sketched an entirely new concept: a hut that could be prefabricated in sections, each interchangeable, each small enough to load onto a truck, train, or ship. The shape was simple: a half-cylinder of corrugated galvanized steel resting on a wooden frame, with plywood ends and a thin floor that could sit on bare ground. Inside, the structure felt cavernous yet intimate, a space that could become anything: barracks, mess hall, medical ward, or even a small chapel. The design was finalized within weeks. Its specifications were precise: 16 feet wide, 36 feet long, with curved ribs of lightweight steel bolted together on site. Every component was standardized, every part labeled. A team of 8 untrained men could assemble one in a single day using only wrenches and determination. By mid-1941, the first prototypes were rising on the snowy fields of Rhode Island. They looked strange, alien almost, but they worked. Wind tunnel tests confirmed their aerodynamic shape resisted storms. Material tests proved they could endure tropical heat and Arctic cold alike. As America entered the war, the design was approved for full production. The U.S. Navy christened it after the place of its birth, the Quonset Hut. It was an industrial revelation. The government ordered thousands immediately. Factories that had once produced refrigerators, automobiles, and farm tools were retooled overnight to stamp out curved steel panels. Railroads began hauling them by the ton to shipyards and air bases. Each crate contained an entire building, packed, numbered, and ready for assembly anywhere on Earth. From the Aleutian Islands to the sands of North Africa, these curved silhouettes began appearing wherever the U.S. military went. The huts became symbols of speed and scale, proof that in this new kind of war, efficiency was as powerful as firepower. By the end of 1942, tens of thousands stood across training camps, supply depots, and coastal defenses. Each one looked identical: Each one carried the same message. America had learned how to build for war, not just fight it. And this was only the beginning. By 1943, the American war machine had shifted into full industrial motion. Every corner of the nation pulsed with production. Detroit built tanks, Seattle built bombers, and across the industrial heartland, hundreds of factories, large and small, had joined the race to produce Quonset Huts. It was a miracle of organization. The Navy's Bureau of Yards and Docks established a strict standardization plan. No component could deviate by even a fraction of an inch. Panels, ribs, bolts, and floors were all interchangeable. That meant any part from any factory could fit into any hut anywhere in the world. This principle, modular interchangeability, was the quiet genius behind America's wartime speed. At the heart of the operation stood the Fuller Company and the Strand Steel Division of the Great Lakes Steel Corporation. These industrial giants coordinated the nationwide network of suppliers that rolled, cut, and pressed steel sheets into the iconic corrugated arcs. Shipments left daily on flatbed trains, hundreds of thousands of panels stamped with serial numbers, coated in zinc and bound for ports on both coasts. Unlike the British Nissen hut, which used heavier steel and required precision construction, the Quonset was designed for brutal simplicity. A handful of sailors or soldiers, armed only with instructions and wrenches, could raise one in hours. The ribs bolted together, forming the characteristic semicircular frame. Sheets of galvanized steel overlapped in a waterproof seal. At each end, plywood walls cut with windows and a door were screwed into place. There was beauty in its efficiency. It required no foundation, could stand on mud or sand, and resisted winds better than box-shaped huts. Its curved silhouette shed rain and snow naturally. And because it could be insulated with fiberboard or lined with plywood, it adapted easily to any environment, from Pacific jungles to Arctic tundra. The result was a universal structure that could serve every purpose. At Camp Edwards in Massachusetts, rows of Quonset huts housed new recruits. At Pearl Harbor, they became machine shops. In Australia and the South Pacific, they became field hospitals and command posts. Even generals lived in them. The speed of production defied comprehension. In early 1942, only a few dozen were built per week. By mid-1943, assembly lines were turning out hundreds per day. The U.S. produced over 153 different variations, some wider, longer, or modified for specific uses: chapels, bakeries, refrigeration units, and medical labs. Each new shipment was accompanied by a set of simple, illustrated manuals, often jokingly described as IKEA for war. Soldiers who had never held a wrench in civilian life could assemble a livable structure by nightfall. The Germans, watching through intelligence reports, were baffled. They had always seen American industry as vast but chaotic, powerful yet disorganized. The Quonset Hut shattered that perception. It was not the product of luxury or abundance, but of discipline. It represented a fusion of industrial engineering and democratic ingenuity. A building for everyone, built by everyone, used everywhere. By 1944, nearly every major U.S. military installation, at home or abroad, contained Quonset Huts. From the deserts of Tunisia to the volcanic ash of Saipan, their silver domes reflected the sun like beacons of order amid chaos. Inside, soldiers slept, repaired engines, wrote letters, and prayed. Each hut carried the hum of humanity beneath its thin steel shell. The Quonset Hut had become more than just a shelter. It was a tool of strategy. Wherever one appeared, a new base could take shape overnight. It gave the U.S. military unprecedented mobility and resilience. Bases no longer depended on permanent infrastructure. They could move with the front lines. In less than 2 years, the United States had achieved something extraordinary: a global network of instant architecture. The huts were not glamorous, but they were everywhere, each one a small monument to the industrial will of a nation at war. And while soldiers lived beneath their curved roofs, another story unfolded: the human, tactical, and technological angles that made the Quonset Hut not just a structure, but a symbol. 1. The engineering angle: simplicity as strength. The brilliance of the Quonset Hut lay in its geometry. A pure arch, mathematically elegant, structurally flawless. The half-cylinder shape distributed weight evenly, eliminating the need for interior supports. That meant no columns, no wasted space, just a wide, uninterrupted interior ready for any purpose. Each rib was a curved truss of lightweight steel, bolted to the necks like vertebrae in a spine. The corrugated steel skin added rigidity through pattern alone, waves of metal that resisted bending and wind pressure. The design's genius wasn't in its complexity but its restraint. Engineers calculated that a Quonset hut could withstand winds exceeding 120 miles per hour and snow loads of over 2 feet. In battlefield conditions, it could be erected without cranes or electricity. Only muscle, bolts, and time. This simplicity turned into strategic power. In New Guinea, where humidity rotted wood and termites devoured timber structures, the Quonset's galvanized skin endured. In Iceland, where winter storms battered everything man-made, its arched frame flexed but did not break. It was architecture stripped to essence, function made form, necessity turned art. 2. The human angle. The hands that built the war behind every hut stood a factory worker, often a woman, often working her first industrial job. They called them Rosies of the Quonset, and they came from towns and cities across America. Inside vast plants in Illinois, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, assembly lines roared day and night. Sparks showered down from welding torches. Machines pressed and curved thousands of sheets of steel each hour. The sound was deafening, a national heartbeat made of iron. Posters on factory walls reminded workers why they were there. A hut today means a soldier under shelter tomorrow. Every rivet mattered. Every crate had to be perfect. The huts weren't just supplies, they were homes for someone's son, brother, or husband on the other side of the world. That awareness gave meaning to the monotony. In wartime America, building a Quonset hut became an act of participation. Farmers' wives packed bolts into crates. College students on summer breaks hammered panels together for the Navy. The line between soldier and civilian blurred. Both served, one with rifle, one with wrench. The workers never saw where their huts ended up, but they imagined. A young welder in Cleveland might have built the barracks where a pilot in the Pacific wrote his last letter home. That connection, invisible yet profound, tied the home front to the front line. The Quonset hut was built not just of steel, but of shared purpose. 3. The strategic angle. The architecture of logistics. War is not only won on the battlefield, it's won in the invisible web of logistics behind it. The Quonset hut was the thread in that web. In 1943, American engineers realized something remarkable. A base could be planned backward. Instead of building infrastructure and then sending men, the huts allowed men to bring the infrastructure with them. On the beaches of the Pacific, Seabees, the Navy's construction battalions, arrived with crates marked Quonset, Model 40X100. Within 24 hours, those boxes became operational command posts, hospitals, or mess halls. This changed the pace of war. Troops no longer had to wait weeks for barracks or storage. They could land on a beach and be living under a roof the next day. A war of months became a war of days. In North Africa, Patton's forces used Quonset huts as field garages, keeping tanks and jeeps repaired within miles of the front. In England, as D-Day approached, airfields filled with endless rows of huts serving as planning centers, radar workshops, and intelligence offices. Each hut became a modular piece in a global machine, proof that industrial power could be portable. The Germans built fortresses, the Americans built mobility. And in the end, mobility would win. The enemy's perspective, shock and miscalculation. From Berlin to occupied Paris, German analysts watched with unease as American industry expanded beyond expectation. Before 1942, the Reich's intelligence believed the United States to be industrially powerful but operationally sluggish. A giant of factories but not of discipline, their data underestimated how fast American logistics could transform ideas into steel and steel into infrastructure. Reports from field agents began describing something strange. Lightweight arched structures appearing overnight in the deserts of North Africa, the jungles of the Solomon Islands, and the frozen Aleutians. German officers dismissed early accounts as exaggeration. No army could possibly build so fast. But as aerial reconnaissance confirmed row upon row of these half-cylindrical shapes, the truth became undeniable. The Americans had industrialized shelter. Captured documents later revealed the astonishment among German planners. One intelligence summary from 1944 noted, "The enemy constructs entire depots, hospitals, and quarters from prefabricated steel. Their logistical flexibility exceeds all predictions. For a military culture built on precision engineering and fortified permanence, the idea of disposable, portable architecture was alien. Germany built bunkers that lasted centuries. America built huts that could cross oceans. This philosophical difference mirrored the war itself. The Germans built to endure. The Americans built to adapt. To the economic angle, efficiency as a weapon. Each Quonset hut cost around $800 to manufacture in 1942, roughly the price of a single machine gun. For that sum, the U.S. military gained a fully functional structure that could house dozens of men, protect vital equipment, or serve as a headquarters. Factories across 35 states shared contracts, producing standardized parts that minimized waste. Every curve of steel was cut to exact efficiency. Nothing was decorative, yet everything was useful. The logistics behind shipping these huts were equally ingenious. A single Liberty ship could carry the disassembled components for hundreds of huts in its hold. Crated compactly, they filled space with mathematical precision, often stacked between munitions and food supplies. Once unloaded overseas, no specialized labor was needed. Soldiers were the builders, following diagrams that required no engineering degree. This simplicity saved countless man-hours and resources. The cumulative result was staggering. In less than 3 years, more than 100,000 Quonset huts rolled off American assembly lines, a feat made possible by mass production techniques pioneered by Henry Ford and refined by wartime necessity. The Germans, despite their technological sophistication, could not match this scale. Their production favored complexity. The American system thrived on repetition. Every identical hut built meant faster deployment, faster housing, faster advance. In a war of attrition and logistics, efficiency became a weapon. And the Quonset hut, humble as it appeared, was one of its sharpest blades. 6. The cultural legacy. Beyond the battlefield. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the Quonset hut did not vanish. It followed the soldiers home. Millions of surplus huts were sold to civilians for a fraction of their wartime cost. Across America, veterans turned them into homes, workshops, churches, schools, and diners. They became the physical memory of a generation that had seen the world rebuilt from rubble and steel. University campuses used them as temporary classrooms for returning GIs under the GI Bill. Farmers stored grain in them. Artists transformed them into studios. Entire neighborhoods of curved metal sprouted across the American landscape, symbols of both resilience and reinvention. Even abroad, they lingered. In Europe and Asia, many stood for decades after the war, reused by local communities for housing or business. Their simplicity made them timeless. Architects studied them, admiring their utilitarian grace. The Quonset's influence would ripple into post-war modernism, inspiring minimalist design, modular housing, and even prefabricated disaster relief shelters. Yet beneath that cultural legacy lay something deeper, a story of democratic design. These huts were not built for generals or presidents. They were built for everyone. Soldiers slept in them. Nurses operated in them. Mechanics repaired planes under their arches. The Quonset hut embodied the spirit of collective effort, proof that victory was not forged by heroes alone, but by millions of ordinary hands. By the end of the war, the curved silhouette had become as familiar as the Jeep, the helmet, or the dog tag. It was not glamorous, but it was honest, and soon, those silver shells would find themselves standing in the middle of history's greatest turning point, the moment when America's industrial power became unstoppable. By mid-1943, the United States had become the most powerful manufacturing force in history. Steel poured from Pittsburgh, aluminum from Washington State, copper from Arizona. Every factory, every machine, every pair of hands was directed toward a single goal: to overwhelm the Axis with production. In that vast machine of war, the Quonset hut was the quiet constant, the invisible architecture of progress. Wherever American troops landed, the huts followed like shadows of steel. The Pacific Theater revealed their full potential. On islands scorched by sun and shell fire, Guadalcanal, Bougainville, Tarawa, Navy Seabees arrived ahead of the fighting to construct entire bases from crates of curved steel. Within hours, hospitals rose where none existed. Airstrips came to life, complete with mess halls, communication centers, and command huts. From the air, these encampments gleamed like clusters of silver scales spread across the jungles and coral beaches. Each one meant security, shelter, and the continuation of war's momentum. The Japanese called them the American domes. Their reconnaissance pilots photographed them repeatedly, unable to understand how they appeared so fast or in such impossible locations. To the enemy, they symbolized a nation that could manufacture geography itself. The miracle was not just the speed of construction, it was the coordination. Crates shipped from Rhode Island or Detroit arrived in the South Pacific labeled in stenciled black letters. Quonset Hut, Model 40X100, Kit Number 7. Each contained every screw, every beam, every bolt packed in sequence of assembly. Even in tropical storms or combat zones, units could be raised in less than a day. A single transport ship could unload enough materials to build a small city. And that's exactly what America did and over again. At Espiritu Santo, a crucial base in the South Pacific, more than 1,000 Quonset huts stood within months, housing everything from machine shops to operating theaters. In the Solomon Islands, they became radio centers relaying messages that connected entire fleets. At Guadalcanal, wounded Marines were carried into Quonset hospitals lit by kerosene lamps, the curved roofs echoing the murmurs of medics working through the night. Each hut told the same story. Speed meant survival. In Europe, preparations for the invasion of Normandy demanded similar ingenuity. Britain, now a fortress of Allied logistics, was transformed by the arrival of American engineers and their strange curved huts. Across southern England, fields and air bases filled with endless rows of Quonsets, forming the living, breathing infrastructure of Operation Overlord. They became map rooms, radar stations, field offices, and sleeping quarters for tens of thousands of soldiers awaiting D-Day. Inside, walls were lined with maps of France, pins marking German fortifications, and telephones that buzzed day and night. For many troops, the last night before boarding landing craft was spent under those arched roofs. Cigarette smoke curled toward the corrugated steel as they waited for dawn, for orders, for history. It was here, under those same steel ribs first bent in Rhode Island, that the invasion of Europe was planned, coordinated, and launched. The Quonset hut had become more than shelter. It was now the silent witness to history's turning point. But the world had yet to see how completely America would redefine the pace and scope of modern warfare, and how the simple, curved hut would stand at the center of that transformation. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Before the first wave of landing craft struck the beaches of Normandy, the logistical foundation of victory had already been built, and much of it curved beneath the iconic arches of the Quonset hut. In the months leading up to the invasion, thousands of these huts dotted southern England like a metallic sea. Each one had a purpose. Some were communication centers linking Eisenhower's headquarters at Southwick House to Allied fleets. Others stored medical supplies, fuel, and rations. Many served as planning rooms where maps of France were marked with pencil and thread, tracing the routes of the coming assault. Inside one of these huts on a cool May evening, senior Allied planners debated the tides, the weather, and the timing of Operation Overlord. The structure creaked softly as the wind pressed against its steel skin, a reminder of how fragile even the most massive undertakings could feel. Yet it held firm, as did the men within it. Beneath that simple curved roof, the liberation of Europe was set in motion. When the landings began, Quonset huts followed the invasion force across the channel. Packed in crates aboard Liberty ships, they were unloaded on the beaches of Normandy, just days after the first assault. Within weeks, they dotted the French coast, housing engineers, medics, and logisticians who turned chaos into order. At Omaha Beach, they became field hospitals where surgeons worked under the echoing clang of rain on metal roofs. At Utah Beach, they became supply depots, stacked high with ammunition and food. Farther inland, near St. Lo, they became makeshift headquarters where generals issued orders that would drive the Allies toward Paris. In every sense, the Quonset hut had evolved from a structure into a strategy. Wherever they appeared, organization followed. German forces retreating through France were stunned to discover how quickly the Americans established functioning bases. Their intelligence officers noted that temporary buildings had become operational facilities overnight, evidence again of industrial mastery applied to warfare. By autumn 1944, Quonset huts stretched from the beaches of Normandy to the edges of Belgium. They housed maintenance crews repairing tanks, intelligence units decoding intercepted messages, and thousands of soldiers resting between battles. As the winter set in, their corrugated shells resisted snow and wind better than any tent or wooden shack. Field reports from the Ardennes described huts surviving blizzards that collapsed lesser shelters. Inside, pot-belly stoves glowed red as men warmed their hands and wrote letters home. The contrast between their simplicity and their impact could not have been greater. They were neither weapons nor monuments, yet they sustained an army that was rewriting the map of Europe. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the same story unfolded on distant shores. At Leyte Gulf and Okinawa, Seabees worked by moonlight to raise hundreds of Quonset huts for hospitals and command posts. As shells exploded offshore, the huts took shape like silver armor spreading across blackened soil. To the Japanese defenders, these structures seemed to grow from the ground itself, evidence that the Americans could rebuild faster than anyone could destroy. By the war's final year, 1945, Quonset huts had become part of the landscape of victory. They were everywhere, lining runways, guarding supply depots, stretching through jungle clearings and along European roadsides. Photographs from the period show their curved silhouettes beside Sherman tanks and P-51 Mustangs. Humble, yet essential companions to the machinery of war. And when Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the first Allied occupation headquarters in many liberated cities were built not in stone palaces, but in Quonset huts. Under their steel arches, surrender documents were signed, supply lines redirected, and the monumental task of reconstruction quietly began. The Americans had built more than a weapon. They had built a system, a philosophy of speed, scale, and adaptation. And that philosophy, embodied in a simple curved hut, had just helped win the largest war in human history. The war ended, but the Quonset hut did not. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world was covered in them, from Normandy's beaches to the jungles of the Philippines, from Alaskan outposts to Mediterranean ports. Each curved structure, once a temporary necessity, had become a permanent landmark of victory. In the months following VE and VJ Day, American bases were dismantled, soldiers returned home, and the machinery of war slowed to peace. Yet hundreds of thousands of Quonset huts remained standing, as if too useful to abandon. The U.S. government suddenly faced a new logistical question: what to do with a small planet's worth of steel shelters? The answer was practical: sell them, transfer them, rebuild with them. Surplus Quonset huts were auctioned off for as little as $1,000 each, sometimes less. They were shipped to universities to handle the flood of returning veterans studying under the GI Bill. On campuses from California to New York, students attended classes in the same type of huts that had once housed soldiers in the Pacific. Professors joked that America's new temples of knowledge had tin roofs and war memories. In small towns, veterans bought them to start garages, workshops, and homes. Churches turned them into chapels. Farmers used them as barns and silos. In Alaska and the Midwest, they became grain stores and tractor sheds. Their simplicity, once born of wartime necessity, fit perfectly into the frugality of post-war life. Even abroad, the huts refused to die. Across Europe, Asia, and Africa, American occupation forces donated or sold surplus structures to local governments. Many became schools and hospitals in war-torn regions. In bombed-out cities like Naples and Manila, the Quonset hut became the first new roof civilians had seen in years. Their curved silhouette was no longer just a symbol of war. It was now a sign of recovery, of rebuilding the world from metal and willpower. Architects began to take notice. In 1946, design journals featured the Quonset hut as a triumph of pure function. It represented the ideal of modernist architecture: minimal materials, maximum utility, and beauty through efficiency. Some visionaries proposed adapting them into prefabricated suburban homes. Others saw in them a blueprint for emergency housing in disaster zones. But for veterans, the huts carried something deeper. Many who had slept under those arched roofs in the mud and cold now found themselves raising families beneath them in peacetime. For them, the metallic curve was more than shelter. It was continuity, a link between survival and new beginnings. By 1947, the War Assets Administration had officially sold more than 150,000 surplus Quonset huts worldwide. The numbers were staggering, but they reflected something greater than quantity: a transformation of wartime ingenuity into peacetime reconstruction. Still, not everyone saw them as symbols of progress. In some places, critics called them temporary scars of war, ugly remnants of conflict cluttering post-war landscapes. Urban planners debated whether they belonged in modern cities. But for the millions who lived, learned, or prayed within their walls, the Quonset Hut was far from an eyesore. It was survival made tangible. In the ruins of the 1940s, where cities had been reduced to ashes, these curved shells offered the one thing the world needed most: shelter. And as the years passed, nations that had once fought under different flags began to share a single silent monument, the humblest building ever to change the world. By the dawn of the 1950s, the Quonset Hut had achieved something extraordinary. It had outlived the war that created it and become a permanent fixture of the modern world. Across the United States, their corrugated silhouettes lined highways, dotted college campuses, and stood on the edges of airfields now converted for civilian use. The same industrial formula that had defeated fascism was now powering a new kind of peace, one driven by innovation, rebuilding, and expansion. In sheer numbers, the achievement was unmatched. Between 1941 and 1945, the U.S. had built over 100,000 Quonset Huts, deployed to more than 100 countries across every major theater of war. Each structure was a piece of the American industrial miracle, a physical embodiment of speed, standardization, and adaptability. Their continued presence in post-war Europe astonished even former adversaries. German engineers, touring Allied occupation zones, examined the lightweight structures with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. Their reports, later published in post-war reconstruction journals, noted how the Americans had turned temporary steel into permanent function. To them, the Quonset Hut represented an entirely new architectural philosophy, one that valued efficiency over elegance and mobility over monumentality. It was, in their eyes, the architecture of democracy, simple, repeatable, and accessible to all. In Japan, U.S. occupation authorities used the huts to rebuild administrative centers, schools, and clinics in cities devastated by bombings. Photographs from 1946 show children attending class beneath their curved roofs, the same roofs that had once sheltered soldiers in the Pacific Campaign. The irony was poignant. Instruments of war had become vessels of peace. Meanwhile, the design itself continued to evolve. The Navy commissioned larger variants, such as the Quonset Warehouse and Super Quonset, capable of storing aircraft and heavy machinery. Civilian manufacturers adapted the design for commercial use, selling kits to farmers, schools, and municipalities. Even the U.S. Air Force, newly independent in 1947, relied on Quonset structures to house radar stations and cold weather outposts during the early years of the Cold War. In Greenland and Alaska, they stood resilient against sub-zero winds, unchanged in form, unchanged in purpose. Everywhere they appeared, they symbolized the same idea: America's ability to build faster than the world could break. But beyond their steel and bolts, the Quonset Huts carried something more enduring: the story of cooperation. Their existence had required architects, factory workers, seamen, soldiers, and engineers to think as one machine, moving toward a shared goal. They were the architecture of unity. In many towns, the huts outlasted the men who built them. Some still stand today, their corrugated skins weathered and rusted yet intact, relics of a time when the line between civilian and soldier blurred, and every hand helped forge victory. To walk into one now, whether a farmer's shed in Iowa or an art studio in Los Angeles, is to step inside the quiet legacy of industrial triumph. You can still hear the echo of hammers from 1942, still feel the cold wind off the Rhode Island shore where it all began. What began as an emergency solution became a global icon of functionality. What began in war became a foundation for peace. The Germans had been stunned not just by the huts themselves, but by what they revealed: a civilization that could mobilize its imagination as effectively as its army. And that realization would reshape the very idea of power in the 20th century, because the Quonset Hut, in all its humble steel simplicity, had proven a truth far greater than the sum of its bolts: that ingenuity, when shared by an entire nation, is the most unstoppable force on Earth. In the story of World War II, it is easy to remember the tanks, the bombers, the ships that thundered across oceans and skies. But history is also built in silence, in the steel curves of a hut that never fired a shot yet helped win the war. The Quonset Hut was not born from genius alone, but from necessity, a moment when the world demanded something faster, lighter, simpler. It was an answer to a question older than the war itself: How do you give form to efficiency? Its half-cylinder silhouette became a new kind of monument, not to victory but to capability. It represented a civilization that had mastered not only destruction, but creation. Every rivet told the story of a worker in Detroit or Pittsburgh who believed that their hands could help build freedom. It is easy to overlook such structures now, rusting quietly on forgotten airfields or hidden behind suburban warehouses. Yet each one remains a time capsule of American ingenuity, proof that democracy could build as swiftly as any empire could conquer. In its simplicity lay its power. The Quonset Hut needed no ornament, no flag, no inscription. Its meaning was in its presence, efficient, humble, and unstoppable. Long after the last hut was assembled, its influence endured. The principles it embodied, standardization, modularity, accessibility, would go on to shape modern architecture, disaster relief housing, and even space habitat design. The line from Quonset Point runs forward through every prefab structure that followed, every emergency shelter that rises where hope must outpace ruin. The Germans were indeed stunned, not just by the speed of American industry, but by the realization that power could be so unpretentious. The curved hut born in the cold wind of Rhode Island had shown that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it simply endures. And so in the grand architecture of war, the Quonset Hut remains the quietest of symbols, not of conquest but of creation. A reminder that the truest victory is not in what we destroy,